The wreath turned out to be heavier than I had expected. Red roses, Garrett's favorite flowers, and dark green cypress leaves, a symbol of mourning. My professional bias compelled me, even now, standing at the coffin, to calculate the load. How much did the wreath weigh? Would the ribbon hold? Would the metal frame bend? 65 years of viewing the world through the prism of calculations and coefficients do not disappear overnight. I, Martha Elkins, stood alone, completely alone, in front of my husband's coffin. 38 years of marriage, and in the end, an empty funeral hall in a small chapel in Greenwood on the outskirts of Savannah. Garrett's few colleagues shifted quietly from foot to foot behind me, keeping a respectful distance, as if afraid to approach the epicenter of grief. However, my grief was quiet, technical, almost calculated, like my whole life. "I'm sorry there are so few of us, dear," I whispered, looking at Garrett's peaceful face, so unusually clean-shaven. When he was alive, he often forgot to shave, especially on weekends. "I thought our children would want to say goodbye to you." The funeral director coughed tactfully behind me, hinting that it was time to begin the ceremony. I nodded without turning around. My black-gloved hand slowly lowered the wreath onto the coffin lid. I tried not to think about how I shouldn't be alone, how our children should be standing there with me. Fergus, Trish, and Wesley. Especially Wesley, our youngest son, the one Garrett always favored, despite his difficult personality, or maybe because of it. My lips pressed into a thin line as I remembered yesterday's phone call. "Mom, I can't make it." His voice sounded detached, as if he were talking about rescheduling a dinner date rather than his father's funeral. "Wesley," my voice remained as clear as an engineer's, "your father has died. We're saying goodbye to him tomorrow at 11. I know he died." There was a pause, and I heard voices and music in the background. "It's just that I have an exhibition planned. I've been preparing it for months." "What does it matter? He won't know if I'm there or not. It's not about him. It's about you." I felt my voice tremble, which was extremely rare. "And me. I'll be there alone." "Exactly, Mom." His voice suddenly became cold. "I don't want to spend my weekend dealing with your tragedies. I have my own life. You're strong. You'll manage, as always." I didn't know what to say. In 38 years of motherhood, I had learned to put up with a lot. But those words caught me off guard, like the failure of a critical component of a cooling system in the middle of a production cycle. Then there were calls from Fergus and Trish. My eldest son cited urgent business matters. A large order for septic systems for a new townhouse development couldn't wait. My daughter simply didn't answer the phone, but later sent a message. "Sorry, Mom, the kids are sick. I can't leave. I'll call you later." The organ music began, pulling me out of my memories. I returned to the present, to this small chapel with faded stained glass windows, to the minister reading the standard words about death and remembrance, to the empty pews where my children and grandchildren should have been sitting. The wreath on the coffin lid was the only large floral arrangement in the hall. Trish sent a modest basket of white lilies. Fergus limited himself to an official wreath with a ribbon reading "From the bereaved family," although the bereaved family itself was not there. There was nothing from Wesley. I looked at the photograph of Garrett standing next to the coffin. The picture was taken 20 years ago. He was still young, with thick dark hair and no gray, wearing a work jumpsuit, smiling his rare but sincere smile. We met on the construction site of a chemical plant in Georgia. I was 24, he was 26. I was the only female engineer on the project, a young professional who had just graduated from the Georgia Institute of Technology. He was a ventilation technician. I remember how he approached me as I was correcting the cooling system drawings right on the hood of a pickup truck. "Miss," he said, taking off his cap, "I'm sorry to bother you, but there's a problem with these drawings." I was outraged. Some technician pointing out mistakes to me, a certified engineer? But he was right. The air duct system I had designed did not take into account the roof's unique design. Garrett noticed this because he worked with these designs every day. "Thank you," I said, redrawing the blueprint. "You just saved the company from a big mistake and me from a lot of embarrassment." "No problem," he shrugged and smiled. "Would you like to have dinner together? Just the two of us. No long courtship, no romantic gestures." We were both practical people. A year later, we were married, and another year later, Fergus was born. Trish came into the world 4 years later, and Wesley 5 years after that, when we had already decided not to have any more children. The priest finished his speech and now asked me to say a few words. I stood up, straightened my shoulders as I always did before an important presentation, and walked over to the small lectern. Garrett Elkins was a good man, I began, my voice sounding unexpectedly firm. Not perfect, but reliable. He was the kind of man who came to help when something broke. Whether it was the ventilation system, a water tap, or someone's life, he silently did what needed to be done without asking for thanks. I paused and glanced around at the small crowd. I noticed Darlene, my best friend, in the far corner. She nodded slightly, and I continued. Our children, unfortunately, were unable to be here today. But I know that Garrett loved them more than anything in the world, even when they didn't live up to his expectations. Even when they strayed from us, he still loved them unconditionally. A lump rose in my throat, and I took a deep breath to maintain my composure. Engineers don't cry in public. Engineers solve problems. 38 years ago, I made the best decision of my life when I agreed to have dinner with a shy ventilation technician. He taught me that not everything in this world can be calculated and designed. Sometimes you just have to trust your heart and move forward without knowing what will happen next. After the ceremony, when the coffin had already been lowered into the ground, Darlene approached me. At 72, she still had amazing posture, a result of decades of working as an industrial diver on oil rigs. Her gray hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her tanned face was lined with wrinkles, but her eyes were clear and steady. "Are you okay?" she asked, hugging me. "Of course," I replied automatically. "Everything's under control." "Don't lie to me, Martha," Darlene said, taking my hand gently. "I've known you for 40 years. Where are your children?" I looked away, staring at the fresh grave. "They're busy. They have their own lives." "Nonsense," Darlene said sharply. "What Wesley said, it's just unacceptable." I looked at her in surprise. "How do you know what Wesley said?" "You called me yesterday after you talked to him, remember?" Darlene frowned. "You were in such a state it was scary to hear, and today you're acting like everything's fine?" I really didn't remember yesterday's call. The last few days had blurred into a hazy stream of events. Garrett's diagnosis, his sudden death from a heart attack, arranging the funeral, calling the children. "Let's go to my place," Darlene said firmly. "I've made dinner. You can't go back to that empty house tonight." "Thanks, but I'm fine." I shook my head. "I need to sort through Garrett's things. The sooner I start, the easier it will be." "There you go again," Darlene sighed. "You've been like this your whole life, Martha. Calculations, plans, schedules. When was the last time you just felt?" I didn't answer. The question caught me off guard, like an unexpected glitch in a flawlessly functioning system. "At least, don't refuse my help." Darlene squeezed my hand. "I'll come over tomorrow morning, and we'll start sorting things out together. But today, you need to rest." I nodded, knowing it was useless to argue. Darlene was the only person who could break through the defenses I had built up over decades of working in the male-dominated world of engineering, where any sign of weakness could be used against you. When I got home, the first thing I did was take off my black dress and shoes and put on Garrett's old work overalls and his worn-out slippers. They were big, but I could feel his presence in them. I went into his study, a small room cluttered with technical journals, tools, and blueprints. On the desk lay an unfinished detective novel with a bookmark on page 143. Garrett would never know who the killer was. I sat down in his old chair and allowed myself to cry for the first time that day. Not loudly, not violently. Just tears streaming down my cheeks as I looked at the photo on the wall. Garrett and I with the children on a picnic by the lake when Wesley was only 7. Everyone is smiling. Fergus is holding a huge perch. Trish is braiding my hair. Garrett is hugging us all with his arms wide open. When did it all go wrong? When did my children become strangers? When did Fergus start looking at me with poorly concealed irritation? When did Trish stop sharing her problems and joys? When did Wesley turn into a cynical egoist, capable of saying such things to his mother on the day of his father's funeral? My phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from Trish. "Mom, how did it go? The kids are feeling better. Maybe we can come over tomorrow?" I stared at the screen, not knowing how to respond. In the past, I would have written, "Of course, dear, I'd love to see you. I'll bake your favorite cake." But something had changed in me today as I stood alone at my husband's coffin, holding the wreath that we were supposed to carry together with the children. "I'll be busy tomorrow," I typed. "Darlene will help me with my father's things. I'll call you when I'm free." After sending the message, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had lifted a heavy burden that I had been carrying for years. I had always been ready to adapt to my children, always putting their needs above my own. I had always been the reliable engineer mom who could fix anything, smooth things over, and organize everything. But today, something broke inside me. Or maybe it was finally fixed. I opened Garrett's desk drawer and took out his notebook, an old-fashioned leather-bound one. He had kept it for years, writing down his thoughts, work notes, important family dates. I had never read it before. I respected his privacy. But now Garrett was gone, and I was left alone with questions that no one could answer. Opening the notebook to the first page, I saw the inscription, "Property of Garrett Elkins. In the event of my death, give to Martha." So he had assumed that I would read this someday. Turning the page, I saw the date, our wedding day, and a short note. "Today, I married the smartest woman in the world. I hope she never realizes how unworthy I am of her." I sat in my husband's chair, leafing through his notebook, and gradually a plan began to form in my head. Not just a plan for sorting out our belongings or organizing a new life without Garrett. No, it was a plan to rebuild the entire system of relationships in our family. As a design engineer with 40 years of experience, I knew that even the most complex systems could be modified if you understood exactly where the failure had occurred. And I intended to find out, using every tool at my disposal. As I fell asleep that night for the first time in a long time, I felt not only grief, but also determination. The determination of an engineer faced with a critical system failure. The morning greeted me with the sound of rain drumming on the roof. I lay in bed, listening to the rhythmic whisper of nature, and thought about how Garrett had always loved rainy days. "These are the best days to work at home," he used to say as he took out his tools. Today, I had to start the most difficult task, clearing out his study, touching his things, his notes, his life without him. I got up and mechanically reached for his side of the bed. Empty. 40 years with one person don't pass without a trace. The body remembers, even when the mind tries to adjust to a new reality. Putting on an old robe, I went down to the kitchen and made myself a strong cup of coffee. The old coffee maker, which Garrett had repaired 3 times, refusing to buy a new one, rattled and splattered, but did its job reliably. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. Darlene stood in the doorway in a bright yellow raincoat, carrying a bag from the bakery and wearing a determined expression. "I brought blueberry muffins," she said instead of a greeting, "and don't you dare say you're not hungry." "Come in," I said, stepping aside. "I just made coffee." We settled in the kitchen, and for the first time in a long time, I felt some relief from the presence of another person. There was no need to pretend to be strong and in control. Darlene knew me too well. "So," she said, breaking off a piece of bun, "where do we start?" "His study," I replied. "That's the hardest part, so I want to do it first." Garrett's study was in the far corner of the house, a small room with a single window overlooking the garden. It smelled of machine oil, old paper, and Garrett himself. The smell hadn't yet dissipated. The shelves were filled with technical journals, boxes of tools, and folders of documents. On the walls hung photographs of various projects he had been involved in and several photos of us together at professional conferences. The large wooden desk by the window was covered with papers, drawings, and notes. I froze in the doorway, hesitating to enter, as if afraid of disturbing the spirit of my husband who might still be here. "Come on," Darlene nudged me gently. "Let's just start sorting through the papers. What do we throw away? What do we keep? What do we recycle?" I nodded and stepped resolutely into the room. We started with the most obvious, technical journals. Most of them were outdated, but some were of historical value, the first publications on new technologies that are now commonplace. I put them in a separate pile to give to the Technology Institute library later. Underneath the magazines, I found a flat cardboard folder labeled GNM Project. I immediately recognized Garrett's handwriting, large and forceful. Opening the folder, I saw our joint drawings, a cooling system for a chemical plant, the very project that brought us together. "Look," I said, showing Darlene the yellowed sheets. "He kept all of this. Even my initial sketches and his corrections are here." I carefully leafed through the drawings, and memories flooded back. The hot summer, the smell of fresh concrete, young Garrett in his faded shirt, explaining to me why my project wouldn't work in real life. His respectful tone, the lack of condescension I so often encountered in other men in the profession. "He always appreciated your intelligence," Darlene said quietly, looking over my shoulder at the drawings. "He never felt threatened by your success." I nodded silently, not trusting my voice. Under the blueprints, we found another treasure, an envelope with photographs. Garrett and I were standing in front of a factory under construction, wearing hard hats and work clothes, young and smiling. On the back of one of the photos was written, "The day I met my future." While I was sorting through the stack of photos, Darlene found several folders with financial documents in the closet. "Everything is neatly arranged by year," she remarked. "He was very organized." "Only in some things," I smiled. "You should have seen his closet." We worked for several hours, sorting, arranging, and occasionally pausing to examine a particularly interesting find. By noon, we had reached the desk drawers. The top drawer contained the usual office supplies, the middle drawer held tools and spare parts for minor repairs. The bottom drawer was locked. "That's strange," I frowned. "I don't remember him having any secrets from me." "Maybe the key is in his things," Darlene suggested. I thought about it, remembering Garrett's bunch of keys. It usually lay on the nightstand by the door, but after his death, I had put it in a box with his mementos. "I'll get it." Among the keys to the house, the garage, and the mailbox, I found a small brass key that fit the drawer lock perfectly. Inside was another notebook, thicker than the one I had found yesterday, and several envelopes. I opened the notebook and saw the words "Family Project Diary" written on the first page. Garrett had been keeping records of our family life as if it were another engineering project. There were notes about the children, their development, our relationships, problems, and solutions. Some of the entries were written in the form of technical reports with analysis of the situation and proposed solutions. "My God," I whispered, flipping through the pages. "He analyzed our family like a complex system." "That's so like him," Darlene smiled, applying an engineering approach to everything in life. I continued reading, and gradually the smile on my face gave way to a worried expression. The notes from the last few years contained increasingly disturbing observations. Problem: growing alienation between Wesley and the rest of the family. Cause: unknown. Possibly related to the incident at Fergus's birthday party. See entry for March 12, 2000. Solution: further investigation required. Interim measures: increase time spent together, create projects that require cooperation. "What incident?" I muttered, trying to remember what had happened on Fergus's birthday 25 years ago. My memory helpfully provided a picture: a festive table, a cake with 18 candles, a tipsy Fergus giving a toast. Something about how glad he was to have followed in his mother's footsteps in a practical profession rather than becoming a useless dreamer like Wesley, who was only 8 at the time. I flipped through a few pages and found an entry dated December of last year. Serious escalation. Fergus is deliberately turning Wesley against us. Overheard a conversation today. Fergus told his brother that we always loved him less, that we're ashamed of his taxidermy hobby. I tried to talk to Fergus, but he denies everything. I don't dare tell Martha. She's already overwhelmed with work. I'll try to solve the problem myself. I felt the blood drain from my face. Garrett knew about the problem and was trying to solve it himself without burdening me. And I, immersed in my work projects, hadn't noticed anything, or didn't want to notice. The envelopes lying next to the diary contained even more shocking revelations. One contained printouts of emails between Fergus and a lawyer discussing the possibility of contesting Garrett's will after his death. The letters were dated last year when Garrett was still healthy. I can't believe it. My voice trembled. Fergus planned to contest my father's will before he got sick. It's as if he was waiting for him to die. Darlene silently placed her hand on my shoulder. In another envelope, I found photos taken on a phone. Trish yelling at an elderly woman cowering in the corner of the kitchen. I recognized my daughter and my mother-in-law, who had died 3 years ago. "Garrett never told me about this," I whispered. "He protected me from the truth about our children." "Or he protected the children from your disappointment," Darlene said gently. "He always tried to keep the peace in the family." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process everything I had learned. My children hadn't just drifted away from us. They had actively worked against their parents, manipulated each other, and planned to profit financially from their father's death. "As an engineer, I should have noticed that the system was failing," I said finally, but I was too busy designing cooling systems for other people's factories to notice how my own family was overheating. "Don't blame yourself, Martha," Darlene squeezed my hand. "You couldn't have known." "I could have and should have," I argued, "but now that I see the problem, I can start working on a solution." I took a notebook and pen out of my bag, an engineer's habit of recording problems and possible solutions. On a blank page, I wrote, "Project Reboot Relationships." "What are you up to?" Darlene asked with interest. "What I should have done a long time ago," I replied, starting to make a list. "Run a system diagnostic and make the necessary changes." The first item I wrote was, "Stop being constantly available to solve their problems." For years, I had been my children's free technical support, babysitter, cook, advisor, and wallet. That had to stop. The second item was, "Find out the truth about Fergus's manipulation." If my eldest son was really turning Wesley against us, I had to find out and put an end to the manipulation. The third item was, "Check Trish's attitude toward older people." If she treated her mother-in-law badly, was the same fate in store for me? "Are you sure you want to go down this path?" Darlene asked, concerned. "It could lead to even more division." "The system is already broken," I replied firmly. "It can't get any worse, and I'm not looking for confrontation. I'll act like an engineer, methodically, based on facts, without emotional outbursts." Darlene looked unconvinced but nodded. "I'll support you whatever you decide. But be careful. People aren't machines." "I know," I sighed, "but some principles work universally. Like cause and effect. My kids are used to their actions having no consequences. That's going to change." As if to confirm my words, the phone rang. Fergus's name lit up on the screen. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded unusually cheerful. "How are you? Are you okay?" "Yes, thank you," I replied flatly. "Listen, I'm having a little trouble with my business tax return. You always help me with that. Can I come over tonight with the documents?" In the past, I would have agreed immediately, put everything else aside, made dinner, and spent the evening sorting through his financial documents. But not tonight. "I'm sorry, Fergus. I'm busy tonight." My voice sounded calm and confident. "I'm cleaning out my father's office with Darlene. And anyway, I think you should hire a professional accountant. I can recommend a good one." There was a pause, so long that I wondered if the line had been disconnected. "Mom, are you okay?" he finally asked, a hint of irritation in his voice. "You always help me with this." "Yes, I'm fine. I just have other priorities right now. If you want, I can give you the number of a good accountant." "No, don't bother," he said, clearly confused. "I'll call you later when you're less busy." "Okay," I replied. "By the way, I was looking through some old family photos. Would you like to come over next week and look at them with me? There are some funny ones from your 18th birthday." It was a little test. If he remembered the incident and felt guilty, he would react nervously. "From your 18th birthday?" A note of concern flashed in his voice. "I'm not sure I can make it next week. I have a lot of work, but I'll let you know." "Sure," I said, trying to sound casual. "Nothing urgent. The photos aren't going anywhere." After our conversation, I caught Darlene's questioning glance. "First experiment," I explained, testing his reaction to a change in my behavior and mentioning a possible trigger. "And what are the results?" she asked with a slight smile. "Confirmation of my hypothesis." I allowed myself a small, smug smile. He was clearly nervous when I mentioned his 18th birthday, and he was very surprised that I didn't rush to solve his problems. We continued sorting through the office, but now I was doing it with a new purpose, looking for additional information about the family dynamics that Garrett had been hiding from me. In one of the boxes, I found a folder with medical records, including the results of a cardiac examination dated last year. The doctor recommended surgery, but Garrett, according to the records, refused. "He knew about his heart problems and didn't tell me," I whispered, feeling a wave of anger rising inside me. "Why, Garrett? Why did you keep it all to yourself?" "He didn't want to be a burden," Darlene said quietly. "He was always like that. He dealt with his problems on his own without involving others." "But I'm his wife. I should have known." My phone rang again. This time it was Trish. "Mom, could you pick up Laurel from school today? I have an unexpected meeting with a client and Rick is at a conference. Normally, I would have agreed without hesitation. I loved spending time with my granddaughter, but today was a day of change. "I'm sorry, dear, but I can't," I replied. "Darlene and I are cleaning out my father's office and it's going to take all day." "But Mom," her voice took on a familiar tone of irritation, "it's an important meeting. I can't miss it." "I understand," I said calmly. "Maybe you could ask one of the neighbors or call a taxi for Laurel." "A taxi? She's 17. "Old enough to take a taxi," I pointed out. At her age, I was living in a dorm and taking care of all my own problems. There was a long pause, and I could almost physically feel my daughter trying to cope with the new situation. "Okay," she finally said. "I'll figure something out, but this isn't like you, Mom." "Maybe," I agreed. People change, especially after something like the death of a husband. After our conversation, Darlene nodded approvingly. "You're holding up well. That's good." "I'm an engineer," I shrugged. "When I see a system that isn't working, I rebuild it. My children are used to me always being available, always ready to help, regardless of my own needs. That model created an imbalance in our relationships." We continued working, and by evening, the office was almost completely dismantled. Most of the documents were sorted, important items set aside, and trash packed up. But most importantly, I gained a new understanding of my family and a clear idea of what needed to change. When Darlene left, I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and opened Garrett's journal to the last entries. "My illness is progressing faster than I expected. The doctors say that without surgery, I have less than a year to live. But I don't want to burden Martha. She already has too much to deal with, taking care of the children, the house, her career. I've always been more of a burden than a help. At least I managed to get all the paperwork in order. Martha won't have to worry about financial matters. I just hope the children will support her when I'm gone. I'm worried about Wesley. He's becoming more and more distant, and I don't know how to fix it. Fergus refuses to talk to me about his problems. Trish is immersed in her own life. I hope that death sometimes brings families together, although judging by the children's reaction to my illness, there is little hope for that." Tears streamed down my cheeks, dripping onto the pages. Garrett knew he was dying and hid it from me so as not to be a burden. And our children. He hoped they would rally around me after he was gone. Instead, they didn't even come to the funeral. I closed the diary and wiped away my tears. Enough crying. It was time to act. Our family system needed a major overhaul, and as an experienced engineer, I knew that sometimes you have to completely dismantle the old to create something new. Looking at the rain falling outside my window, I began to sketch out a plan of action. Relationship changes don't happen overnight, but the first steps had been taken. I would no longer bend to my children's needs at my own expense. I would set healthy boundaries, and I would find out the truth about what had been going on in our family all these years. A week passed after the funeral. I was gradually getting used to the new rhythm of life, without Garrett's morning cough in the kitchen, without the creaking of his favorite chair in the evenings, without the quiet snoring next to me in bed. Every day, I made small changes in my behavior. I stopped answering my children's calls right away, didn't rush to solve their problems, and took time for myself. Small steps toward a new life. That morning, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the hummingbirds hovering over the feeder. Garrett had made the feeder 3 years ago, and every summer the tiny creatures would come to us. I thought I could hear my husband's voice in their buzzing wings. See, Martha, my work continues to bring joy even after I'm gone. The sound of a car pulling up snapped me out of my reverie. A battered blue pickup truck slowly made its way down the gravel driveway toward the house. I didn't recognize Wesley's car right away. The last time I saw him, over a year ago, he had a black sports car he bought with the money from selling a sculpture. My heart sank with anxiety. My last conversation with my younger son, the one where he refused to come to his father's funeral, still hurt. But I decided to remain calm. As an engineer, I knew that emotions only got in the way of problem solving. Wesley got out of the car, and I was surprised to see how haggard he looked. He had dark circles under his eyes, his clothes were rumpled, and he had stubble. He had always been conscious of his appearance, even as a teenager when he was experimenting with different styles. "Hi, Mom," he said, shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other at the foot of the stairs. "Hello, Wesley," I said, not moving from the spot, not offering a hug as I would have done before. What a surprise. "Yeah, he stammered, trying to find the right words. "I was just driving by and thought I'd stop in, see how you're doing." Even now, he couldn't be honest. Passing by, our house was 20 miles from the nearest highway, on a dead-end country road. "Come in," I nodded toward the door. "Coffee?" We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and the silence between us felt like a physical barrier. Wesley fidgeted with his cup. "So, how are you?" he finally asked. "I'm managing," I replied curtly, sorting through my father's things, getting used to the new reality. "That's good," he nodded, not looking at me. "What are you planning to do with the house?" So that's what it was, the inheritance. "Live in it," I replied calmly. "It's my home, Wesley. It's the home your father and I built together." Of course," he nodded quickly. "I just thought, well, it's so big for one person, and it must be expensive to maintain." "I'm managing," I repeated. "Why did you come, Wesley? Really?" He sighed heavily, finally meeting my gaze. "I'm in trouble, Mom. I'm getting evicted from my apartment. I'm 3 months behind on rent, and the landlord won't wait any longer. Why didn't you pay?" "I didn't have the money." He shrugged, as if it were obvious. "My last exhibition was a flop. No one buys taxidermy in this economy. People think it's cruel to animals, even though I only use ones that died of natural causes." I suppressed the urge to roll my eyes. Typical Wesley. It's always circumstances' fault, never his own. "And what do you want from me?" "I need a place to stay." He looked at me imploringly. "Just for a couple of weeks until I get back on my feet, and maybe a small loan. 10,000 should be enough to pay off my debts and start a new project." In the past, I would have agreed without hesitation. I would have given him my last penny, cleared out the guest room, and cooked his favorite meals. But not today. "Don't you have any savings?" I asked, even though I knew the answer. "You know how it is in the arts," he said, spreading his hands. "Today you're on top, tomorrow you're at the bottom." "What about the money from that big sale last year? You said a museum bought your work for a serious amount." Wesley grimaced as if he suddenly had a toothache. "I invested everything in a new studio and materials. I thought it would be a good investment." "And what happened to the studio?" "The landlord terminated the lease when I couldn't pay," he said, lowering his head. "He took all the equipment to cover the debt." I sighed, feeling a familiar mixture of disappointment and maternal love. Despite everything, he was my son, but right now, he didn't need to be saved. He needed a lesson. "Wesley, you can stay here for 2 weeks," I said firmly, "but there are conditions." He looked up, surprise flashing in his eyes, then relief. "Sure, Mom, anything." "First, no money. I'm not giving you a penny." I saw his face change, but I continued. "Second, while you're here, you're going to help around the house. I'll make a list of chores today." "But Mom, I need to work on my new projects." "Third," I interrupted, "you're going to find a job. Any job. Waiter, cashier, whatever. You're 33 years old, Wesley. It's time you learn to take responsibility for yourself." He looked at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. "You've never set conditions before," he finally said. "You never refused to come to your father's funeral before," I replied, and saw him flinch. "Things are changing, Wesley. I'm changing." He was silent for a long time, studying his hands. I waited, ready for him to refuse and walk out, slamming the door behind him. But he surprised me. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll agree to your terms." "Great," I nodded, trying not to show my surprise. "The guest room is upstairs. You can take your things there." "Actually," he hesitated, "I was thinking about the basement room. There's more room for my tools." "No taxidermy in this house," I said firmly. "If you want to work, do it in the garage." He opened his mouth to argue, but met my steady gaze and changed his mind. "Fine, the guest room is the guest room," he muttered, getting up from the table. "Thanks, Mom." When he left, I allowed myself a small smile. The first phase of recalibrating the system had been successful. That evening, the doorbell rang. Standing on the doorstep was a man about my age, wearing a pressed shirt and holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Martha?" he asked uncertainly. "You probably don't remember me. I'm Owen Barrett. I worked with you and Garrett on the oil refinery project in Houston in the 90s. I stared at his face, trying to match the graying man in front of me with the image of the young electrical engineer I remembered. "Owen, of course," I smiled, recognizing his familiar features. "What a surprise. Come in." "I was at Garrett's funeral," he said, walking into the house. "I wanted to come over, but you were surrounded by people, and then I saw you leave with your friend." "Darlene, yes," I nodded, leading him into the living room. "What brings you here now?" "I recently moved to Savannah," he said, handing me the flowers. "I'm retired, but I can't sit around at home, so I'm working as a consultant at the Technology Institute. And when I saw you at the funeral, I thought, maybe you'd be interested in consulting? The Institute is looking for experienced engineers to work with young people." I accepted the flowers, surprised by his offer. "Owen, I've been retired for 3 years." "What, your brain's rusty?" He smiled, and I saw in that smile a glimpse of the young engineer who always joked around at staff meetings. "Martha, you were the best cooling system designer in the state. The students could learn a lot from you." At that moment, Wesley peeked into the living room, attracted by the sound of an unfamiliar voice. "Mom?" He glanced suspiciously at Owen. "Is everything okay?" "Yes, Wesley," I turned to him. "This is Owen Barrett, a former colleague. Owen, this is my youngest son, Wesley." The men exchanged reserved nods. Wesley cast another wary glance and went upstairs. I mentally noted his reaction. He didn't seem to like having a stranger in the house. "You have a grown son," Owen remarked when Wesley had left. "Does he live with you?" "Temporarily," I replied. "He's in a difficult situation." Owen nodded understandingly, not asking any further questions, which I appreciated. "So, what about the consulting job?" He returned to the previous topic. 3 hours a week, working with senior students, analyzing real engineering problems. The pay isn't great, but that's not what matters. It's an opportunity to pass on my experience and stay in the profession. I thought about it. Until that moment, I hadn't considered returning to work in any form. After retiring, I had devoted myself entirely to my family, helping with my grandchildren, taking care of the house, supporting Garrett. But now, as I was rethinking my life, "It's an interesting offer," I said finally. "When do you need an answer?" "The sooner, the better," Owen smiled. "The new semester starts in 2 weeks, but I'm not rushing you. Take your time." We talked for about an hour, reminiscing about past projects, mutual acquaintances, and discussing changes in the engineering industry in recent years. It was strange and pleasant at the same time to return to professional topics after such a long break. I felt a part of me that had been dormant for a long time come back to life. When Owen left, promising to stop by in a couple of days, I went up to the guest room where Wesley had settled in. He was sitting on the bed with his laptop, looking at some photos of his work. "Interesting visit?" he asked, without looking up from the screen. "Yes." I leaned against the doorframe. "Owen offered me a job as a consultant at the Technology Institute. It caught his attention." He looked up, frowning. "A job? Why do you need a job? You have your pension, your father's money." "It's not about the money, Wesley," I shrugged. "It's about staying active, using my knowledge, feeling useful." "But you're already useful." He seemed genuinely puzzled. "You help us. You look after Trish's children. Is that all I'm supposed to do for the rest of my life?" I asked gently. "Be a standby grandmother and an ATM for grown children?" He looked away, embarrassed. "That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant, Wesley," I sighed. "But I don't want to limit my life to family responsibilities anymore. I'm an engineer, and that's an important part of who I am. So now you're going to spend your time with your students instead of your own grandchildren?" His voice sounded hurt. "Not instead of, but together with," I corrected him. 3 hours a week isn't that much, but even if it were more, I have a right to my own life, Wesley. And speaking of grandchildren, did you know that Laurel is interested in engineering?" He looked at me in surprise. "Really?" "Yes," I smiled, thinking of my 17-year-old granddaughter, Trish's daughter. "She's very good at math. She's asked me about my work, but I've never found the time to talk to her about it seriously. Maybe now, that will change." Wesley nodded thoughtfully. "You really are changing, Mom. Life changes, Wesley. We either change with it or get left behind." The next morning, I made a list of chores for Wesley. Fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom, trim the hedge, help clean out the garage. He accepted the list without objection, which was unusual. That evening, Trish called me, sounding annoyed. "Mom, Wesley just called. He said he's staying with you. Is that true?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "He's going through a rough patch. And you just let him in the house? After what he said? After he didn't come to his father's funeral?" Interesting. Trish had never expressed such outrage at her brother's behavior before. "He's my son, Trish, and your brother," I reminded her. "But if it bothers you, he has 2 weeks to find a job and a new place to live. I've set clear rules." "Rules?" Her voice sounded incredulous. "Since when do you make the rules around here?" "Since I decided it was time to stop being a convenient resource for my adult children." There was a long pause. "What's going on, Mom?" she finally asked more quietly. "You seem different lately." "I'm finally starting to live my life, Trish," I replied honestly. "By the way, I've been offered a job as a consultant at the Technology Institute. I think I'm going to take it." "A job?" She looked shocked. "But why? You're 65. "I plan to live at least another 20 years, I said dryly. "I'm not going to spend them sitting in a rocking chair." "What about the children? Who will pick up Laurel from school when I'm at work? Who will look after the twins when Rick and I have business meetings?" "There are babysitters, Trish, and taxis, and after all, Laurel will be going to college soon. She's quite independent." "I can't believe we're discussing this," she said, sounding genuinely upset. "After your father died, I thought you'd spend more time with your family, not live my own life." I finished for her. "Trish, I love you and your children, but I'm not just a grandmother and a mother. I'm also a person with my own interests and needs." "Fergus was right," she muttered. "You really have changed." "Have you and Fergus been talking about me?" I asked, feeling the muscles in my neck tense. "He called yesterday and said you refused to help him with his tax return. That's not like you, Mom." "Maybe it's time you got to know the real me, not the person you're used to seeing," I said gently. "Let's talk later, Trish. Say hi to Rick and the kids." I hung up, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and satisfaction. The children's reaction was expected. They were used to a certain pattern of relationships where I was always available, always ready to help, always putting their needs above my own. Changing that pattern was met with resistance. But as an engineer, I knew that when a system is out of balance, an external force is needed to restore equilibrium. Sometimes that means a complete overhaul, sometimes just a few tweaks. In the case of my family, it required both. The next day, I called Owen and agreed to his offer of counseling. We agreed to meet at the Institute on Monday to discuss the details. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, Wesley came into the kitchen. He looked tired but content. "I fixed the faucet in the bathroom," he said, pouring himself a glass of water, "and I trimmed the hedge. Tomorrow, I'll tackle the garage." "Thanks," I nodded, continuing to chop vegetables. "How's the job search going?" He sighed as he sat down at the table. "I sent my resume to a few places, an art gallery, a natural history museum, even an art school. But nothing yet." "What about regular jobs?" I asked without turning around. "Stores, restaurants?" "Mom, I'm an artist," he said, sounding hurt. "I can't work as a cashier or a waiter." "Why not?" I turned to him. "It's honest work that will provide a steady income while you develop your art." "But it's humiliating," he exclaimed, throwing his hands up in the air. "After solo exhibitions and publications in art magazines." "You know what's humiliating?" I interrupted him. "Living off your mother at 33, or not going to your father's funeral because you have more important things to do." He fell silent, looking away. I could see the color of shame rising in his neck and cheeks. "I'm sorry for what I said," he finally muttered. "I was not myself. Problems with the exhibition, breaking up with Jane." "That's no excuse, Wesley," I said, returning to cutting vegetables. "But I appreciate the apology, and yes, any job is better than no job." We ate dinner in silence, broken only by the clinking of cutlery. I could sense that Wesley wanted to say something but couldn't bring himself to do so. Finally, he gathered his courage. "Fergus called today." I looked up from my plate. "What did he want?" "He asked if it was true that I was living with you." Wesley twirled his fork. "He said you were acting strange, that you were letting some man take care of you right after your father died." I snorted in surprise. "Owen? Court you? He just offered me a job." "Fergus said he saw his car outside your house last night," Wesley shrugged, "and that you'd never been interested in working since you retired, and now, suddenly, you've accepted. He thinks this Owen has influence over you." "What else did Fergus say?" I asked, feeling my irritation growing. "That you're changing for the worse, that after your father's death, you should be focusing more on your family, not, how did he put it, chasing after new men in your career." I slowly put down my fork, trying to control my anger. "Fergus has no right to tell me how to live my life," I said calmly, "and neither do you, Wesley. I'm a grown woman, and I'll make the decisions I think are right for me." I just passed on what he said. Wesley raised his hands in a defensive gesture. "Personally, I think you have a right to your own life, and this Owen seems like a decent guy." I looked at him in surprise. Such support was unexpected. "Thank you, Wesley." "You're welcome." He smiled awkwardly. "I'm just starting to realize that maybe we all took you for granted. We always counted on you to be there when we needed help, but we never thought about what you wanted." That was the most conscious statement I had heard from Wesley in many years. Perhaps the boundaries I had set were already taking effect. "I'm glad you understand," I said softly. "And you know, these changes in my life don't mean I'm not your mother anymore. It's just that now I'm going to be a mother who has her own interests besides taking care of grown children." Wesley nodded, looking at me with a new expression, a mixture of respect and slight surprise, as if he were seeing me for the first time. "By the way," he remembered, "the Natural History Museum called. They're looking for a taxidermist to restore some of their exhibits. They want to interview you tomorrow." "That's great news," I smiled. "See, your skills are appreciated after all." "Yeah, but the pay isn't great," he sighed. "Still, it's better than nothing." "Wesley, money isn't the only measure of success," I remarked. "A stable job that's related to your calling is a great opportunity." He nodded thoughtfully, and I saw a glimmer of the thoughtfulness he had shown as a child, before he learned to hide behind a mask of cynicism. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I thought about how Fergus and Trish would react to my changes. Their concern was predictable. They were losing a convenient resource that I had been for them for years. But I was surprised by Wesley's reaction. Of all my children, he was the one I expected to resist change the most. Instead, he seemed to be starting to understand me better than the rest of them. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had since the day of the funeral. When I went down to the kitchen, I found Wesley already dressed in a shirt and pants, an unusual choice for him, who preferred t-shirts and jeans. "Interview today?" he asked, turning on the coffee maker. "Yes, at 10, he said, nervously pulling at his sleeves. "Do you think I need a tie?" "For a museum?" I shook my head. "I don't think so. A shirt is fine." He nodded with relief and returned to his toast. It was strange to see him like this, nervous before an interview, like a normal person, not the confident artist he always presented himself to be. After he left, I decided to call Fergus. It was time to dot the I's and cross the T's with him, too. "Hi, Mom," he answered after the third ring. "How are you?" "Fine," I replied. "Wesley said you called him yesterday, talking about me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Well, I'm just worried about you," he finally said. "Since Dad died, you've been acting unusual." "What exactly is bothering you?" I asked bluntly. "The fact that I'm no longer always available to solve your problems, or that I've decided to go back to work?" "It's not that, Mom," he said defensively. "It's just that you've always been so predictable. And now you're letting Wesley move in with you after everything he said. You're seeing some man." "Fergus," I interrupted, trying to remain calm. "I'm 65 years old. I'm a grown woman and I can make my own decisions. I love you all, but my life doesn't have to revolve around you." "But you've always been like this," he exclaimed. "You've always put your family first." "And I'll continue to do so," I assured him. "But family first doesn't mean me last. I have a right to my own interests and activities." "That Owen put you up to this, didn't he?" His voice was tinged with irritation. "He thinks he can replace your father?" "Fergus," my voice was steely, "Owen is a former colleague who offered me a job as a consultant. Nothing more. And even if there were something more, it's my business, not yours." "Not your business?" he almost shouted. "You're my mother." "Of course it's my business." "No, Fergus," I said quietly but firmly. "My personal life is my personal life, just as your personal life is your personal life. I don't interfere in your relationship with Mandy. I don't demand to know your every move, and I expect the same respect from you." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Fergus said in an unexpectedly calm voice, "What's wrong with you, Mom? This isn't you." "On the contrary, Fergus," I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "This is me, the real me. The woman who had spent 30 years designing cooling systems for the country's largest industrial facilities. The woman who had raised 3 children and built a successful career. It was just that in recent years I had allowed myself to forget that part of me. After talking to Fergus, I felt drained, but strangely liberated. It was as if I had thrown off a heavy burden that I had been carrying for years. Wesley returned in the evening, beaming with joy. "I got the job," he announced from the doorway. "Not a permanent position, but a 6-month contract. If all goes well, they promise to extend it." "Congratulations." I was genuinely happy for him. "When do you start?" "On Monday," he said, plopping down in a chair, still smiling. "You know, it's strange. I've been struggling for years to be recognized as an independent artist, with all the exhibitions and competitions, and now I'll just be a museum employee, and for some reason, I feel relieved." "Stability has its advantages," I remarked, "especially when you do what you love." "Yes," he nodded thoughtfully. "And also, they were impressed by my portfolio. They said I have a rare talent for detail." I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there for a long time, genuine joy at being recognized. Not false confidence or cynicism, but simple human happiness that his skills had been appreciated. "I always knew you were talented, Wesley," I said softly. "Sometimes people just need structure to allow their talents to shine through." He looked at me with a new expression, as if he had really heard what I was saying and not dismissed it as usual. "Thank you, Mom," he said quietly. "And I'm sorry for everything, for not coming to the funeral, for what I said. I was an idiot." "Yes, you were," I agreed, but without anger. "But you're my son, and I love you no matter what." He smiled awkwardly, and I saw in that smile a glimpse of the little boy I once knew, sensitive, intelligent, painfully impressionable. The next day, Sunday, there was an unexpected knock at the door. Standing on the doorstep was Laurel, my granddaughter, Trisha's daughter. Tall, dark-haired, with intelligent eyes so like mine when I was young. "Grandma," she hugged me, "Mom said you're going to teach at Tech. Is that true?" "Not exactly teach," I corrected, leading her into the house. "I'll be advising students on real engineering projects." "Why?" "I want to go with you," she blurted out. "Tomorrow, when you go there for your meeting. Can I?" I looked at her in surprise. "Of course you can, but why are you so interested?" Laurel sat down on the edge of the sofa, clutching her backpack. "I applied to the engineering department at Tech. I want to specialize in renewable energy, and it would be great to see the institute from the inside, meet the teachers. Wait, I interrupted her. You applied to tech? Your mother said you were going to the state university, to the business school. Laurel rolled her eyes. She wanted me to go there. She said business was practical and engineering was too difficult for a girl. I felt a wave of indignation rising inside me. My own daughter was discouraging my granddaughter from following in my footsteps because it was too difficult for a girl? Laurel, I sat down next to her, taking her hand. If you're really interested in engineering, you should follow your calling. And yes, it's difficult. But if you have a penchant for the exact sciences and a desire to create something real, there's nothing more worthwhile. I knew you'd support me. She beamed. Mom says you've been acting weird lately, but to me you're even cooler now. I laughed, touched by her words. Thank you, sweetie. And yes, of course you can come with me tomorrow. I think Owen will be happy to meet you. Owen? She raised an eyebrow. The Owen Mom was talking about with Dad? Like Grandma's new friend? I rolled my eyes just like she had a minute ago. Your mom has too much imagination. Owen is a former colleague who offered me this job, just a friend. If you say so, Laurel smiled with slight disbelief. But you know, Grandma, even if he was more than a friend, there's nothing wrong with that. Grandpa would want you to be happy. The wisdom coming from the mouth of a 17-year-old girl made me pause for a moment. Then I hugged her, feeling an unexpected warmth in my chest. Thank you, sweetie. I appreciate your support. When Laurel left, promising to pick me up tomorrow morning, I suddenly realized that for the first time in a long time, I was truly looking forward to tomorrow. Returning to college, meeting new people, having the opportunity to apply my knowledge and experience again. It excited me like nothing had in a long time. Darlene called that evening. How's the relationship reboot project going? She asked without preamble. Surprisingly well, I replied, telling her about Wesley getting a job, Fergus being upset about my new independence, and Laurel wanting to be an engineer. I told you it would work out, she said with satisfaction in her voice. You've always been strong, Martha. You just let your children forget that. And myself, too, I admitted, but it won't happen again. And how's Owen? She asked with a hint of mischief in her voice. Is there something going on between you two? Darlene, I laughed. You're like my granddaughter. No, there's nothing going on between us. He's just a nice man who offered me an interesting job. Not yet, she corrected. But he's clearly interested. Don't forget, I saw the way he looked at you at the funeral. You're hopeless. I shook my head, though she couldn't see it. There's too much going on in my life right now to think about that. Whatever you say, she didn't insist. The important thing is that you're living again, not just existing. Garrett would be happy to see you like this. After our conversation, I stepped out onto the porch and looked up at the starry sky. For the first time since Garrett's death, I didn't feel the weight of grief pressing down on me. Of course, I missed him, his quiet presence, his love. But now there was something else mixed in with the sadness, a sense of new possibilities, new horizons. I thought about how my relationships with my children had changed over the past week. Wesley, who for the first time in a long time was starting to act like a responsible adult. Fergus, indignant that he could no longer control me. Trish, worried about losing her free babysitter. And Laurel, who had unexpectedly become my closest ally. The family dynamic was indeed recalibrating, slowly but surely moving toward a new equilibrium. And I, Martha Elkins, a design engineer with 40 years of experience, was finally applying my professional skills to the most important system in my life, my own family. 3 months flew by in what felt like a day. Autumn had painted the trees around our house in shades of gold and crimson, and the morning mists rising over the bay reminded me of the times when Garrett and I would sit on the porch with cups of coffee, silently watching nature awaken. Now I sat there alone, but strangely, I didn't feel lonely. A phone call interrupted my thoughts. It was Owen. Martha, good morning. His voice sounded enthusiastic. Remember you said you wanted to do some kind of practical project, not just consulting? Of course I do, I smiled, remembering our conversation after another session with the students. I have something interesting for you. The Industrial Technology Museum has received a donation of an old industrial cooler from the Miller chemical plant, the one you designed in the 80s. They want to restore it as an exhibit, but no one knows how it worked. My heart skipped a beat. The cooling system for the Miller plant was one of my first major projects. I designed it when I was 27, when most of my male colleagues doubted my abilities. Are you serious? I couldn't believe my ears. It still exists? Not only does it exist, but it's almost complete. Of course, it needs serious restoration, but all the main components are there. The museum director asked if I knew anyone who could help with the restoration. I immediately thought of you. I'm in, I replied without hesitation. When can I take a look at it? This afternoon? I'll pick you up at 2. After our conversation, I couldn't sit still. I went over the details of the project in my mind, remembering the design features. The system was innovative for its time, using a dual-circuit cooling system with energy recovery. I designed it to minimize heat loss and reduce energy consumption. The plant manager said at the time that I had saved the company thousands of dollars a year. At 2 o'clock, Owen's car pulled up in the driveway. Over the months, we had become good friends. He didn't try to replace Garrett, didn't pressure me or rush things. He was just there, supportive, listening, sharing his stories. Sometimes we went to the movies or had dinner at a small restaurant by the bay. I appreciated his company and gradually got used to the idea that life could start over at 65. That the Industrial Technology Museum was located in a former foundry, a huge brick building with high ceilings and iron beams. Along the walls stood machines, engines, and industrial equipment from different eras, from 19th century steam engines to automated production lines from the late 20th century. The museum director, an energetic man in his 50s named Raymond Prescott, greeted us at the entrance. "Mrs. Elkins, I can't believe I'm meeting the creator of this legendary system," he said, shaking my hand vigorously. When the Miller factory contacted us about the possible transfer of the equipment, I immediately remembered that this system was considered groundbreaking for its time. "Just Martha, please," I smiled, and yes, for the 1980s, it was quite an advanced design. "Follow me." Prescott led us through the showroom to the far corner of the building. We've placed the components in the restoration workshop. When we entered the spacious room filled with workbenches and tools, I saw it immediately. My system, the main heat exchanger, compressors, distribution nodes, all the key components were there, albeit in disassembled form. Many parts were covered in rust, some pipes were deformed, but the core remained intact. I moved closer, running my hand over the metal surface of the heat exchanger. A strange feeling came over me, as if I had met an old friend after a long separation. "It served for 35 years, Prescott said quietly. "The factory closed last year, and the new owners decided to donate the historic equipment to a museum instead of sending it to the scrapyard." 35 years, I repeated, shaking my head. "I designed it for 15 years of service." "That's why we want to restore it," Prescott said, gesturing around the room. "It's a piece of industrial engineering that has stood the test of time. We have a workshop, tools, and volunteers with mechanical experience. The only thing we lacked was the knowledge of how it all works." "I can help," I nodded, already mentally assessing the amount of work involved, "but I'll need the original blueprints." "Unfortunately, they weren't found in the factory archives," Prescott said, spreading his hands. "No problem," I smiled. "I have them. Or rather, Garrett had them. I found them while cleaning out his office. The next day, I brought a folder of yellowed drawings to the museum. Laying them out on a large table in the workshop, I immersed myself in studying my own work from 40 years ago. It was a strange feeling, like talking to myself, young and ambitious, not yet knowing how her life would turn out. Prescott organized a small team of volunteers, 2 retired mechanics and 3 engineering college students. I became the project manager, drawing up a detailed restoration plan and assigning tasks. For the first time in many years, I felt in my element, solving technical problems, explaining how things worked, showing how different components fit together. Working on restoring the cooling system became a kind of therapy for me. It gave me solace when I missed Garrett particularly badly. I felt his presence as I worked with the drawings he had carefully preserved all these years. One day, as I was poring over a particularly complex distributor assembly, trying to figure out how best to restore it, Laurel walked into the workshop. My granddaughter became a frequent visitor to the museum after she enrolled in the Renewable Energy Engineering program at the Institute of Technology. "Grandma, I brought the blueprints you asked for," she said, placing a tube with copies we had ordered from the Institute's archives on the table. "Wow, you've already assembled the compressor." "Yes, Tom and Harry finished it yesterday." I nodded to the two retired mechanics who were tinkering with the pump in the far corner. "Would you like to see how we connect it to the heat exchanger?" "Sure." Her eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "But first, I have a surprise for you." She turned toward the door and waved her hand. Wesley entered the workshop hesitantly. I had rarely seen my younger son in recent months. After 2 weeks at my house, he had found a place closer to the Natural History Museum, where he now worked full-time. We talked on the phone once a week and sometimes met for dinner, but he had never shown any interest in my new project. "Hi, Mom," he said, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot. "Laurel said you were restoring some old machine." "An industrial cooling system," I corrected, surprised by his appearance. "The one I designed early in my career." "That's cool," he said, coming closer and looking curiously at the parts laid out on the table. "I've never seen your work before, in action, I mean, only the blueprints in my dad's office." "It's not in action yet," I smiled, feeling strangely excited. "But it will be when we're done." "Uncle Wesley, look," Laurel pointed to the drawings. "Grandma came up with this when she was younger than you, can you imagine? And this system has been working for 35 years. Wesley leaned over the table, studying the details of the drawing. "Wow," he muttered, "that's impressive. I never understood what you did at work." "Most people don't understand what engineers do," I shrugged. "Our work isn't as visible as, say, architecture or art." "But it's just as important," Wesley said seriously. "Without systems like these, there would be no modern buildings or manufacturing." I looked at my son in surprise. He had really changed over the past few months. He had become more thoughtful, less cynical. "Want to help?" I asked impulsively. "We need some extra hands to clean the small components of rust." "Me?" He looked surprised. "But I don't know anything about mechanics." "You don't need any special knowledge for this job," I said, handing him a brush and a can of solvent. "Just carefully clean the rust off these valves without damaging the threads." To my surprise, Wesley rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He worked slowly and carefully, with the same meticulousness he applied to his taxidermy exhibits. Meanwhile, Laurel helped me connect the pipes, listening attentively to my explanations of the principles of heat exchange. We worked like this for several hours, grandmother, granddaughter, and son, united by a common cause. I stole glances at Wesley, noting his concentration and patience. Perhaps in another life he would have made a good engineer. "You know, Mom," he said when we took a coffee break, "I never thought I'd be interested in something technical. I always thought of myself as a pure artist." "Art and engineering aren't that different," I said. "In both cases, you have to see the whole picture and understand how the parts fit together. Like reconstructing an animal from bones and skin." He nodded, his eyes lighting up. "I have to imagine what the living creature looked like and recreate it using the materials available." "Exactly," I smiled, delighted by this moment of understanding. "You reconstruct the past, I reconstruct mechanisms." After that day, Wesley began to visit the museum regularly to help with the restoration. He never stayed long. His main job was very time-consuming. But those few hours of working together gradually rebuilt our relationship, which had been destroyed by years of mutual misunderstanding. Laurel became my constant assistant. She would come after class and bombard me with questions about how different components worked, the decisions I had made during the design process, and the difficulties she faced as a woman in a predominantly male industry. To her, I was not just a grandmother, but a mentor, a guide to the world of engineering. Work on the cooling system progressed slowly but surely. Every day we restored some part of it, cleaned it, repaired it, connected it. Gradually, the disparate components turned into a single system, complex but harmonious. One day, while Laurel and I were checking the connections on the main circuit, Trish walked into the workshop. She rarely came here, even though she knew about my project. After our conversation about my return to work, my relationship with my daughter had become strained. She couldn't accept that I was no longer always available to help with the children and household chores. "Mom," she smiled uncertainly, "I was driving by and thought I'd stop in. Laurel said you were almost done." "Yes, just need to set up the automation and run some tests," I said, wiping my hands on a rag. "Want to see?" Trish came closer, looking at the system with interest. "That's impressive," she admitted. "I've never seen your work on this scale." "Mom, look," Laurel pointed enthusiastically to a complex distribution node. "Grandma designed this part to minimize energy loss. It was an innovative solution at the time." Trish looked at her daughter in surprise. "You really understand how this works?" "Of course." Laurel stood up proudly. "Grandma explained everything. I even used this system as an example in my term paper. Professor Richardson was impressed." I saw a look flash across Trish's face. Jealousy? Surprise? Pride? Perhaps all of the above. "I didn't know you were so interested in engineering," she said quietly. "I've told you many times, Mom." Laurel rolled her eyes. "You just always wanted me to go into business." Trish turned to me, and I saw something new in her eyes, a respect I hadn't noticed before. "You were right, Mom," she said unexpectedly. "When you said I should live my life and not just take care of us, I can see how you've changed over the past few months. You're glowing." I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged my daughter. She tensed for a moment, then relaxed, pressing herself against me like she did when she was a child. "I'm sorry I was so selfish," she whispered. "I just got used to you always being there, always helping. When you suddenly started saying no, I was scared I was losing you." "You're not losing me," I stroked her back. "It's just that now, I'm not just a mom and a grandmother, I'm also an engineer, a consultant, a project manager. And all these roles make me happier, which means I'm better for all of you." She nodded, pulling away and wiping her eyes. "Fergus is still angry," she said with a slight smile. "He says his accountant charges 3 times more than your free consultations cost." We laughed, and the tension of the last few months began to melt away. Trish didn't stay long. She had a meeting with a client. But that short visit was the first step toward repairing our relationship. A week later, we completed the bulk of the work. The system was fully assembled, all components cleaned, repaired, and connected according to the original design. All that remained was to conduct the final tests before the official opening of the exhibition. On the day of the tests, not only our team of restorers came to the workshop, but also several journalists from the local newspaper, the director of the Technological Institute with a group of students, and, to my surprise, Fergus. He stood apart from the others, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot, but he had come nonetheless. "Is everything ready?" Prescott asked, checking the connections one last time. "Ready," I nodded, feeling my heart pound with excitement. "Laurel, check the pressure in the circuit." My granddaughter leaned over the pressure gauge, serious and focused. "The pressure is normal, Grandma." "Then let's begin." I took a deep breath and turned the main switch. There was a low hum, the system shook, and in a moment, coolant rushed through the pipes. The compressor started up, the valves opened, and the huge mechanism came to life after many years of inactivity. "It's working!" exclaimed one of the students, and the room filled with applause. I stood with my hand on the warm metal of the casing, feeling the vibration of the mechanism. The cooling systems I had designed throughout my career were operating in plants and factories across the country, but never before had I felt such pride and satisfaction as I did at that moment. Fergus approached me, holding out his hand. "Congratulations, Mom," he said with a respect I hadn't heard in his voice in years. "That's impressive." "Thanks for coming," I said, shaking his hand, and he unexpectedly pulled me into a hug. "I'm sorry for everything," he whispered. "I was such an idiot. I just didn't realize how amazing you are." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. My stubborn, practical older son, who had always considered my career insignificant compared to my role as a mother, had finally seen me for who I truly was. After the formalities and interviews with the journalists, I remained alone in the workshop. Owen offered to drive me home later, but for now, I had time to be alone with my creation. I sat on a chair in front of the restored system, listening to its steady hum. There was something soothing about the sound, like the beating of a huge mechanism's heart. I thought about the journey I had been on over the past few months, about Garrett, who had carefully stored my drawings all these years, about the children who had gradually learned to see me not only as their mother, but as a person with her own aspirations and talents. About Laurel, in whom I saw my continuation, my engineering legacy. I thought about how often we view human relationships mechanistically, as if they should work on their own without maintenance or updating. But any system, whether mechanical or human, requires attention, care, and sometimes major repairs. Some connections, like the old components of my cooling system, can be restored, cleaned of the rust of time and resentment, and returned to working order. Others have to be replaced, recognizing that they are too damaged to be repaired. Still others need to be modified, adapted to new conditions. I, Martha Elkins, design engineer, widow, mother, grandmother, mentor, and friend, have rebuilt not only an old industrial system, but also my life. I have built new connections, strengthened those that could still be saved, and learned to let go of what could not be restored. Wesley's silhouette appeared in the workshop doorway. "Mom, are you still here?" He came closer, looking admiringly at the working system. Amazing, isn't it? Something you created with your own hands continues to live on after so many years. Yes, I smiled, thinking not only of the mechanism in front of us, but also of what I had created in my life. My children, grandchildren, career, relationships. Amazing. You know, Wesley sat down next to me, his eyes fixed on the pulsating pipes of the system. I always wanted to create something that would outlive me, something meaningful. I thought it would be my art, but now I realize that meaning can be found in all sorts of things. The main thing is to put your heart into it. I took his hand. Whether it's a cooling system, a stuffed animal, or human relationships. He nodded, squeezing my hand tighter. "I'm proud of you, Mom, and I think Dad would be proud too." Laurel appeared in the doorway, followed by Owen, ready to drive me home. "Grandma, Professor Richardson is here and wants to talk to you about giving a master class for the upperclassmen," Laurel said excitedly. I stood up, taking one last look at my system, my new life. "I'm coming," I said, heading for the door where the people who had become part of my new structure, complex, imperfect, but working, were waiting.